Greetings, Guardians, my name is Bife here. It's that time of the season again where I decide to offer a little critique of the season that just passed. At this point in time, if you're a regular to the channel, you know the drill very well. Leave your own constructive criticism and thoughts on what you did or didn't enjoy about the season and the last expansion down below in the comments section. If Bungie does take a listen to this video, then there's a chance that they might pick up on some of those comments as well, especially if there's a really strong sentiment behind them. As for me, it's the same spiel as usual, so yeah, let's go ahead and talk about what happened last season and what Bungie did well and what they didn't, and hopefully offer a little advice and criticism. So let's go ahead and start with the good, and I think it's clear that we've completed by this point the transition to a point where the discussion around Destiny's narrative has been completely rewritten. If you take a look at Beyond Light, you had a cookie-cutter villain, a seasonal story with some interesting story hooks but not much in the way of weekly engaging content or dialogue, and of course, the missed opportunity of giving us darkness powers but not actually letting us engage with the entity behind the darkness that we now know as the Witness. Although at the time being we didn't know that they were called the Witness, you get my point. We got dark powers and it was seemingly just given to us, and then the darkness, as we knew it at the time, kind of just waved us off and was like, okay, go have fun. And that wasn't really too satisfying. This isn't to say that Beyond Light and its entire narrative was bad. I think there were definitely really good parts of it, particularly the developed story around Clovis Bray, the Exo Stranger, and everything that was going on in Europa with the Exos. All of that stuff is really good, as is some of the other plot lines that came forward with the Elixni and everything that was happening within Erasmus's house. You know, these were all good plot lines and threads, whether they were picked up in the story or in the lore. But I think that it really was showing very well that inflection point between the older and newer styles of Destiny 2 campaigns. The older style was typified with Beyond Light, and that older style contained a reasonable story with a decent premise, but with villains that really weren't well developed, and as a result were sort of a non-factor throughout the story, or were just big showdowns at the end without as much build-up as there could or should have been. The big example that really bucked this trend might have been Forsaken, where we at least had a little introduction to Aldrin, and we sort of got a little bit more on him through the cutscenes that we saw throughout the story. Eramis kind of got that, but other than that, I feel like Eramis did suffer from that sort of villain of the week malaise that has previously plagued a lot of Destiny's villains. When this happens, we really don't know much about the villain to begin with, and that's kind of what happened with Eramis. She got just enough character development in the story that it was a passable story conclusion, but it really wasn't much to write home about. The thing is, this is also the point at which we unknowingly have Savathun entering our story, and this is why I say it's an inflection point. Savathun was built up narratively long before the Season of the Hunt, but Beyond Light might as well have been the year of seasonal content building up to the Witch Queen. You see, when you had Season of the Hunt dropping, and Season of the Chosen, and Season of the Splicer, and Season of the Lost, all of those moments slowly started to build towards the narrative where Witch Queen would begin. And whilst Beyond Light showed Eramis being a villain that we were suddenly introduced to, and we really couldn't care much about by the end of the campaign, Season of the Hunt started to rectify that mistake and turn it over to the point where we would actually care a lot about Savathun even if we weren't introduced to her prior. This, again, is the inflection point. It starts to show clearly that we have passed the point where we are talking about Destiny's narrative in one sense, and now we're talking about it in a completely different sense. No longer is it the case that these villains come out of nowhere, and no longer is it the case that if they do, they feel unsatisfying, or as though there isn't some kind of justified narrative sense for them suddenly appearing. Everything has a reason now, and there are things that hint to them, and when you do see those hints, it makes for a really great story. I think it's also clear to see that the narrative conversation around Destiny generally changed with the release of Witch Queen, and the big story test there for Witch Queen was really whether it was able to make an 8-hour campaign that told a compelling story and appropriately closed a chapter of Savathun's story, whilst opening the next one for whatever villain might step into her shoes for Lightfall, which of course we now know to be the Witness. To put it really simply, Savathun couldn't afford to be an Eramis, and her story had to lay the foundations for the final battle between light and dark. Now, the answer to the question of whether Bungie succeeded at that or not is a subjective one for sure, but I think it's fair to say that the comfortable consensus was that Bungie succeeded in doing just this. This is why I say the discussion has really changed around Destiny and its narrative. I don't think people sitting there and telling me that the story is bad is even something I even see that much anymore. I think I remember one person telling me that they thought that Witch Queen's narrative was not great in certain places, and that stands out to me because it was the only person I saw throughout the entirety of the season. With everyone else, I have people telling me what they liked and disliked about the elements of the story, and people comparing it to the seasonal content and talking about the different ways in which they would have presented it, but generally speaking, the consensus was that the bar of storytelling quality was put pretty high, and was put on comparable levels with the seasonal content, if not surpassing it. That seasonal content being a part of the discussion is important, by the way, because the seasonal content was so good that before Witch Queen had been released, it had set a new bar. Season of the Chosen was a season where people like SkillUp, who commonly will take a look and analyze Destiny seasons, were able to sit down and say, oh my god, what happened to Destiny? This season feels like an expansion. And you know what? He's right to make that comparison. The narrative turned around, and it was really up to Witch Queen to meet that bar or exceed it. The story in Witch Queen, I think, did just that, and it did, I think, also set some of the other expectations we had for it in place, and it succeeded at meeting those too. It's Savathûn, so you expected some kind of master plan to really unfold at the end of all of this, and I think it's fair to say that that happens. But the big story revelations that we get with regards to the Hive just before the final mission, yeah, that was also fantastic. All of this was building towards what was realistically a fantastic package for the story of the campaign. And I think it's pretty simply said that when you paired all of this together with the way that Savathûn was presented, yeah, it's really hard to top her as a villain. I think it's easy to say now that she is the best villain Destiny's expansions have ever seen, with a ton of dialogue, a sense of personal interaction between you and her as a villain, multiple points at which you've interacted with her before the Witch Queen expansion even began, points at which you can interact with her after the final boss battle in the Altar of Reflection, points at which you can hear her take on different things, a great final boss battle, which I'm so happy to say is finally multi-phased, and was also, quite importantly, something where we were actually talking to her the whole time, and it wasn't just some silent, riveting groans or angry shouts like it was with Oryx, or any of the other story bosses that we've had thus far for that matter. And then finally, some really fantastic voice acting that truly elevated the character. Easily you combine this package and you can say without a shadow of a doubt, Savathûn is the best villain that Destiny's ever seen. And I'll be all the sadder to see her go, but by that same token, I don't think that her story is even over. And I think that that's the right choice from Bungie's narrative team, because you know what? Yeah, Savathûn is the kind of person who would have contingencies in place. She may have died, but Imaru being the one who's there to save her? Yeah, no, that's totally a thread that Bungie is deliberately leaving out there. Witch Queen's campaign alone is a cut above everything else that we've seen out of the game, but it becomes even better when you look at the narrative of the Season of the Hunt, Chosen, Splicer, and Lost, and how they all fed the key story moments leading into Witch Queen. So yeah, story-wise, the campaign is good. They did Savathûn justice, and her story might not even truly be over, of course, but I think it's also really good to note that whilst the story stands on its own 2 feet, it's only made better by the addition and the presence of those seasons. And I think also we can start to see that Bungie has learned their lesson from the Season of the Hunt and what they did well with that, because you know what? The major challenge for Bungie was setting up a story hook that they would be able to take into future seasons, and that story hook, I think, quite clearly comes from the raid and all of the stuff that comes in Season of the Risen. At very least, the story hook that will lead us into Lightfall has been teased at with Rulk and the raid and the theme of the darkness and the witness and everything that goes on there. So that's really good, because Bungie can now use those narrative hints and pick that story beat up when it comes to Lightfall, something that they will inevitably do at some point, but also they have other story threads leading them forward, whether it's Rasputin and the Nefele stronghold, whether it's Callus against Keitel and the battle over the Scions within their various ranks, whether it's something completely different. There are threads that they can tug on, and I think that they may have left enough of those out there for us to continuously tie the story from one part of its narrative into the next, from one season that we're sitting in currently to the next season, which, as of recording this video, has still not got a trailer. Yeah, irritating, but we'll get it. It's fine. They probably have a plan in place for that. Bungie is basically getting better at tying those stories together, and I feel like if the previous year is anything to look at, then I think it's very fair to go ahead and say that, yeah, we'll be looking at these next few seasons and how they might tie into the next expansion, Lightfall. And that's going to really affect the shape of those seasons too, so I'm excited to see what that does. That's a good story hook, and knowing that that's what's coming, yeah, it's exciting. I think if you're going to go ahead and talk about the story, that's all good and well, but I think it's also fair to say that at this point in time, we shouldn't start talking about the lore as though it's the same as the story. So, the story was good, but what about the lore? Was the lore also good? Short answer, yes. I think the really good thing about the lore in Witch Queen is that it takes some of those really deep lore hooks, whether they're new or old, and buries them just below the surface of the ground that you're going to tread. They're not immediately relevant to everything that you might need to do in the moment, but they do help to drive the story home, and if you want to investigate them, you absolutely can, and all the information is there, and you can do an interesting investigative dive into all of it. The perfect example for all of this is Deep Sight. It's a power which you learn which helps you to navigate the throne world. You upgrade it as time goes on and you gain ranks with Finch, but it's a power that you learn which helps you to really get the most out of your throne world experience. And whilst it is something that is, basically a mechanical component, kind of similar to the old Ascendance buff, it's also explained within the story, and it has a narrative purpose within the campaign which you use it for. Of course, yeah, it's not just for spawning platforms like with the Ascendance buff, it's also got narrative implications when you have the scenes at the Altar of Reflection, or when you create your first Deep Sight weapon, the Enigma. These are all powers brought on by Deep Sight, and Bungie does an okay job of explaining the very basic foundations of what that is. A player can understand that base story hook and go deeper if they truly want to understand more of it, but at the same time they can keep playing and will basically kind of understand what's going on with all of the lore stuff as a surface level thing if they just decide to continue. You're also presented with all of the additional information in a fairly easy to understand manner. If you want to go ahead and understand more about Deep Sight, then it's very easy to pick up the quests from the evidence board, which is literally right next to where you would craft your weapons and on the opposite side of Ikora, and also in the lore that you would have picked up when playing the Witch Queen campaign. In fact, you should also take a look at the lore that you'll learn just by doing the Altars of Reflection, because, yeah, of course, a lot of lore comes from there. Easily a lot of lore comes from there. And you learn a lot through that, even if some of it is lies. So, yeah, Deep Sight is kind of this poster child for everything that Bungie is doing with the lore at current. They are weaving it into the central narratives of their stories, but if you really do want to go deeper, they're making it so that that lore is a lot easier to access than it would otherwise be. And that's a good thing. It really is a good thing, especially for those of us who actually sit behind and will read the quest steps. I know that's not everyone, but for those of you who do, yeah, good on you. Excellent stuff. I mean, to put it most simply, it's this. If you're talking about an element of the lore like Deep Sight, you can sum it up in a sentence as simple as, Deep Sight reveals truths and memories, or you can go ahead and do what I do and do the long thesis, PhD-length explanation of timelines and alternate possibilities and how it interacts with the relic, etc. That's why the lore of Witch Queen is so good, because there's a lot of elements that do this. They go and they provide you story threads at surface level, and then you can dig much deeper if you so desire. The lore of Witch Queen is also just pretty important in the grand scheme of things. Some seasons we get odd bits of lore here and there which are much more about personal moments and characters. Sometimes these can feel really fascinating. I want to talk about two examples of lore from this season of The Splicer which demonstrate this a little bit better. The first of which is Achilles Weaves a Cocoon, which is very much one of these lore stories which has a nuanced moral question at the heart of it, and it contains some really interesting characters, and they slightly link in with the vast majority of what's going on in that season, but it's not something which you immediately get to interact with. You never even see Namrask, who is the main character of those lore books. He doesn't appear in that lore at all, but it drives home an important question within the lore. And then, in that same season, you got Ada 1's lore book about her discovery of the loom and the passion that she took for basically helping the Guardians discover transmog, and her helping to find her place in the world after the Armory's forges were shut down, and yeah, one of these to me is really compelling and the other one isn't. Ada 1 is a character that I know people love, but I just was not passionate about that lore book. So much so, I haven't even read most of it. Some things will grab your attention and other things just won't. Witch Queen can't have all of these massive revelatory things all the time, 100% of the time. But it has to be said, a lot of the time, there are big revelatory things in Witch Queen's lore. You do have your typical thought-provoking insights. Things like the Lucent Tales lore book are absolutely fantastic for that, but buried in there are nuggets that give us ideas about how genuinely huge the changes in Destiny's world might be right now. And then you have lore books which genuinely change the game, and lore tabs which provide context in clear detail about some of the most important events in Destiny's history. If you want an idea of all that, I mean, just look at the raid armor and the raid lore. Shattered Suns might be one of my favorite lore books ever, because it gives us plain context about one of the most cool raid villains we've ever seen, and also gives a gratifying story to him alongside not only what we experience of him in the raid, but also the preservation mission. And then there's the raid armor, which also tells us about his exploits, and about the important exploits of things that are really important to the Hive story, like the Worm Gods. It tells us about an entire species that he wiped out that might not even be relevant to things, but it just goes to demonstrate more of Rolk's character. If the Arslid ever do come up as a plot point at some point, that might be interesting, but they probably won't. It's probably just to illustrate, hey, Rolk was trying to do these things and he failed. And that's awesome that we have that context. We have all of these things that point towards him and his relationship to the Witness, and man, you know, that stuff's fantastic. And that's not even getting into all the other things that occurred in this expansion. Exotic glaives with both their lore tabs and the evidence board quest that you use to get them. Some of the lore that got dropped from the Season of the Risen lore stuff. The really interesting tidbits here and there that have Savathûn interwoven into all the narratives of it. I mean, honestly, some of it is just, oh man, it's gravy on top of a great narrative, but a lot of it feels like it's actually much more important than your typical lore fare. Some seasons it can feel slow. Not this season. This season is pretty fantastic as far as all the lore stuff is concerned. Again, not everything needs to be revelatory, but it's really nice to see a lot of stuff that I care about. You know, whether it's just a random seasonal sparrow giving a little bit of an insight into the conflicted feelings that Amanda has about Crow and Aldrin, or whether it's, you know, an absolutely heart-melting story from the perspective of Saint 14, when he's talking about Osiris and his past with him, or whether it's the tales of the Lucent Hive, who in the helmet for the seasonal lore armor are literally just being tortured by not-so-Lucent Hive. You know, all of these are cool, compelling lore pieces, and Witch Queen's chock full of them. Nothing to complain about there. Season of the Risen content, really quickly, was short but sweet. It makes me content to know that the narrative of the season, even when it was just 4 weeks long, was still pretty strong. There were certainly shock and awe moments. I remember when I saw the thing that Crow does in the final week. Yeah, that made me gasp on stream. And yeah, that's one of the 3 big moments that I will remember from the Witch Queen and Season of the Risen times. It's really well done. So good job on that, Bungie. I'm really excited to see where that stuff goes. Not much more to say on it. It just looks like it's a lot of narrative stuff that's going to point us towards where we're going in the future. So that's all good. Before we go on to everything that's bad, let's talk about exotic quests though. And I feel like exotic quests, well, they have an interesting place in Destiny because they're almost universally seen as pretty good. Parasite, the exotic that we get from this season's exotic quest, although granted it's more of this expansion's exotic quest, Dead Messenger being the seasonal one, yeah, Parasite hits the bar for what we can expect out of an exotic quest. When I compare it to the quest for, say, Argus Scepter, or Ruinous Effigy, or The Lament, I'd say that it hits the bar it needs to, but it's also something that provides really great character interactions generally. I was exhausted doing that quest, but it has to be said I was still hooked. The reason I was exhausted, by the way, was because I did it on day 1, after playing 12, 16 hours of Witch Queen on day one with Barb and Chroma, I don't know how much. We just finished the Legendary campaign, we were doing it on stream, we were doing T-Slape stuff, and the day one grind was really quite tiring, but the story hooks and the premise of it was so good that Barb and I just kept going, and I was fascinated. I got a second wind off of that. So, in that sense, it does go slightly above other exotic quests because the story thread of what happened that saved us in the collapse was just so big. But then the character interactions started happening, and that was where things really started to get exciting. Because you know what? Character interactions with Wormy Boy, aka Raymond, were really cool, and just very funny, and honestly, the entire thing ends up being hilarious and comedic. There were a few people who were a little hesitant to shoot a worm out of a gun at the onset of Parasite's reveal, but the idea of Raymond constantly complaining as he is lobbed towards my enemies and then is reloaded back into the gun only to have it happen again and again, that entire idea to me is absolutely hilarious now, and the fact that Raymond is continuously talking to us pulls on this thread that Bungie loves to do of your weapons are literally alive. And you know what? I hope they keep pulling on that thread in the future, because genuinely, it can be hilarious. Raymond going and debating with our Ghost is some of the funniest dialogue to me just because I know how much it upsets Ghost. And you know what? Yeah, I want more of that. Genuinely, I want more of it. If they ever bring back Super Good Advice, a machine gun from Destiny 1, I hope they remember that it's supposed to talk to its user and it is supposed to have a certain degree of sass to its voice. So if they do add a voice actor for Super Good Advice, I really hope they do find a way for them to channel that sass that a Golden Age AI within a gun can have. That makes me really excited. What's more, Parasite's exotic quest was good because of the way that it made us look at the world of Destiny generally. It was one of those moments at which you started to have to really question the true motivations of Mara Sov and the Worm, and even of the Traveller. You sat and you wondered what's going on here. And it's at this point which I need to start slowly changing from talking about things that are good to potentially talking about the things that are bad in Witch Queen. Although I want to go ahead and say that the reason I'm starting with this is because it's nuanced and I think you could see it either way. And the real thing about Parasite that makes me say this is this. It makes you ask the real simple question of who is really on whose side. The Witch Queen as a whole is kind of a plethora of points for this question. It is the continuation of the question of nuance that was introduced in Beyond Light. In previous expansions, in Destiny 1 for example, it was very easy to lump the words Light, Lightbearer, Guardian, Traveller, Lost City, and Good together in the same broad category, and to say, yes, if you mentioned one of these things, you're kind of also mentioning the others, you assume that they're all tied together with association. That's fine, cool. And by that same token, you could easily do the same with Dark, Darkness, Hive, Pyramids, and Evil. It was this very easy binary narrative for people to look into. Beyond Light represented the start of a movement away from that in very real terms, and it was this understanding of the world of Destiny permanently changing from one where it was very easy for you to distinguish between light and dark, to one where light and dark really didn't mean as much as they used to. They, in fact, were deeper in terms of their meaning, but you couldn't tie them to moral associations anymore. You now look at the Traveller, and you can understand that it does indeed have its own agenda, and that it might not necessarily align with our own agenda, and that when you look at the Guardians of Earth, not all of them even are necessarily serving the interests of the city. Some of them might in fact not even identify as Guardians. They might be light bearers that are out there serving their own interests, such as the Drifter. And on that note, not all Guardians have to be good. I mean, take a look at the story of Shayura, Aisha, and Reed, where one of their fireteam members kind of goes rogue and kind of goes off the rails and is being hunted down and is seen as pretty evil. But in the meantime, you have another member of them wielding darkness and actively saving an Elixni in the street from a riotous mob. She uses darkness, so the people of the city see her as evil, but all of a sudden, she's saving someone who's being attacked for doing nothing wrong, so she's doing an act of good, but she's using darkness and stasis to do it. The whole point of all of this discussion is to say that the nuance that Destiny has imagined within its universe is now much broader than it's ever been. You can take a look at a single character and start to build their associations up, and the fact that you can do that is fantastic, because now you get to craft those complex narratives, and you get to see who's really on whose side. And to understand that there is a lot more complexity to it than normal. Hell, even the way that conflict is expressed in the throne world kind of portrays this. You have two forces of light, the Guardians of Earth and the Guardians of Savathûn and the Lucent Hive out there, and then you have a force of darkness in the form of the Scorn that serve Rhulk and the Witness. And none of these powers are aligned. Savathûn, of course, previously allied herself with the Witness, but she betrayed the Witness, and so she is very much against all of the Scorn that the Witness has sent in there. The Scorn certainly are not allying anytime soon with the Guardians, even though the Guardians also wield darkness, because we're actively trying to fight the Witness. And you might think, okay, surely that puts us and Savathûn on the same side? No, absolutely not. They're Lucent Hive. We believe they stole the light up until the last point of the campaign, and even after that, we're in their throne world invading and trying to actively kill them because they are trying to actively kill us, and a lot of their rituals have worked to the point where they are invading real space and trying to take Guardian territory. So you have this three-way war, and before it would have been really easy to divide things into good side and bad side, and now you just can't anymore. You know, you can look at the moral shades of grey in Destiny and tell a very complex story with a lot of different layers of depth with it. But whilst this is a really good thing, for the sake of a well-established player who really loves Destiny, for a new player, I can imagine this makes Destiny a little trickier to understand. This is not something that I want Bungie to stop, because the complexity that this lends Destiny is fantastic, and it gives them the ability to weave those very complex stories together. But what I would say is maybe look at where this lands new players. It's not to say that I want the campaigns dumbed down at all, because I love where Witch Queen was, and I think that it truly does shine. It shows some of the best examples of lore and storytelling to date. But I do think it is still worth having those new players in your mind when you go through and you start telling those stories, because you know what? Yeah, it can be very complex, and new players do need that very simple dialogue to start them off with before they slowly start getting introduced to more and more shades of grey. It's very simple for them to sit there and say, okay, I am a Guardian, I fight for the city, I fight with the light, I am good, to start with, and to then slowly pick apart what all of those different pieces of your identity mean and why they don't always align. That, I think, is the thing that they have to do, and honestly, I have the faith that they'll be able to do it well. Now, though, we need to go ahead and talk a little bit more about the bad side of things, and it's at this point that I need to make a few qualifying notes to my analysis that follows, which is simply this. Witch Queen, alongside Season of the Risen, delivered a lot of content to us, but that content also left us with an observable problem. Not with the content that was being delivered, but in the timing and the way it was delivered. Now, I don't know what was happening inside Bungie, but I imagine that there might have been a conversation where they looked at players who stated they were dissatisfied with the weekly drip feed of content and said, okay, sure, we'll front-load the content we have instead and see if that's more satisfying to them. Again, that is purely my speculation. I don't know if that conversation took place, I don't know if that's the motive behind the way they released the content in this season, I don't know what was going on, and I don't want to speculate that I am correct. But, regardless, factually speaking, the reality of it is that we got 4 weeks of content from the Season of the Risen at the very beginning of Witch Queen's life cycle. Then there was nothing. When this content is front-loaded, this is really great, and in the moment it feels amazing, because you know what, it feels like there is so much to do, but it means that the season really ran out of steam very quickly. By week 5 we had a single radio conversation from Keitel about Zavala's progress within the Cabal to talk about, and that was kind of it. From then on it was just titles, gameplay, and, well, anything that we were doing with the Master Raid, etc. There's no real story from that point onwards. But I think it's worth remembering that there are people who look at that dead time and who might drop off the game a bit. Now, this is one of those moments at which we need to understand that we don't know Bungie's exact goal for all of this, and we don't understand if the front-loading of the seasonal content was part of a deliberate idea or whether it was just the nature of delivering the content. I don't know. Either way, I think it's worth thinking about and talking about from Bungie's end. I don't want to ascribe what they were trying to do to it, because, again, we don't know, but I think it's worth thinking about that approach. Subjectively, there are advantages and disadvantages to the drip-feeding or front-loading discussion, but I feel like front-loading things alongside Witch Queen ended up being a mistake in the long run. We're not lacking for content, and the content that we are getting is really good. I would say that it's some of the best that we've had in a while, especially considering that, well, the last season lasted 6 months, so yeah, it's been the best we've had in a while because a while was a long time. But honestly, looking at the way that the seasonal content got delivered, I think it is worth remembering that the tempo of the delivery of that content is probably as important as the content being delivered itself. In a perfect world, I might have perhaps looked at what happened in week 3 or 4 of the Witch Queen and used that as a basis for creating the seasonal narrative. If maintaining players is the focus, but then again, maybe maintaining players isn't necessarily the focus. Maybe it is about providing a really great experience and then letting people come back when there is more. I don't want to assume what the actual idea at Bungie is, but again, I wonder whether it's worth looking at that again. Because, you know what? The front-loaded side of the season did feel really great when it was there. You know, it felt like the Season of the Risen was a coherent part of the narrative around the Witch Queen expansion. Everything you do in the Season of the Risen happens because of what you experience in Witch Queen, and it's an important thing to acknowledge how seamless the connective story threads felt in those first few weeks. But I think that's the real question. Is that trade-off of that first 4 weeks worth of feast worth the famine that follows in the 8 weeks after? And that's realistically where I would ask that question to Bungie. Is that what you guys want? If so, it's not necessarily wrong or right, but it's something to think about. There is going to be that balance of people who want things front-loaded for them, and then there's going to be that balance of people who want it more spread out. Honestly, I don't know where you leave that. I don't know where that leaves Bungie, but I think it's worth thinking about this. They've effectively tackled a lot of stuff to do with the content drought side of the game, with 4 seasons launching every single year and with a new narrative for each one that rolls over every 3 months. They're working at a pretty incredible pace, and you can be invested in the narrative each week and still not really play that much if you want to. It only takes a couple of hours each week to continue the TV-esque story that you get to do, and then of course there's all the other things that can draw you back week by week. It's really much more about ironing out the kinks of the delivery of these story moments than it is about crafting good story moments in itself. I will say, though, that the fact that this is where the conversation about the lore has landed, it gives me a lot of confidence. You know, I sit here and I really do think that if we're going to expect the same quality from the seasonal offerings as we got in Season of the Chosen, Season of the Splicer, and Season of the Lost, then we're in a really good place. I honestly do hope that that's how the trend continues, and if it goes on for another year, then hey, we're in a golden age of Destiny. I'm really excited to see where that narrative goes. But I think there's one last thing I want to say, which is simply this. If Bungie's to look to the future, I think the next thing they need to do is to build Destiny's characters and story threads to a point where there is life beyond the expansions that we know about currently. At current, we know the final shape is on the horizon, and that is supposed to be the end of the Light and Dark saga for Destiny. That is the end of the 10-year journey. Here's the thing, if Destiny is to have life beyond that 10-year journey, they need to start building those character arcs and those stories and those narrative threads up right now. There are questions that need to be addressed when it comes to the end of the Light and Dark saga, and I'm sure that a lot of things will come to the end and lots of character arcs will be wrapped up and all of that, but if we're going to move on to something different, something bigger, including perhaps a Destiny 3, we're going to need to build a significant threat as well as compelling characters that can command that threat or be subject to that threat or oppose that threat, etc. If Bungie really wants there to be life beyond the final shape, then they need to start thinking about building those story threads and narrative moments out going forward pretty quickly. It's time to look to the future. It's time to think about where Destiny goes next. And that's what I want to see over the next year. Yes, do as you've done. Build towards what is inevitably going to be Lightfall and a expansion or two based around the Witness. That's going to be fantastic, I'm sure. But keep the future in mind and start building towards that now. We had 5 years to prepare for Savathûn. We had 5 years to look and see what was going to be in the narrative for all of that. and 5 years of teasing. Now, we need to sit there and think about who the next Savathûn is. Exhausting as that may be, it's better to start thinking about it now so that we can get to those story threads as time goes on. That's all from me for now. Thank you for watching this lengthy video. We'll be getting more content to you as the time goes on throughout the rest of the week. I imagine that I may have, by this point, also covered a trailer for the new season that will have dropped. If it's not, then I'd be astounded. But yeah, expect also a recap of everything that happened in the Season of the Lost and the Season of the Risen and Witch Queen, because I never actually recapped things that happened in Season of the Lost. And yeah, Season of the Risen and Witch Queen just finished up, and that's the other video that I typically do. So, without much further ado, that's going to be it from me. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and leave a like. If you want more Destiny content, hit subscribe and the bell next to subscribe. And of course, know that your viewership, as always, is quite enough for me. And that in the meantime, my name is Bife. Per audacia ad astra. I'll see you, Starside.